A military genius shocks the world by leading his army and war elephants across frozen mountains to challenge a mighty empire. This is the story of Hannibal Barca, a name that would echo through the annals of history, a commander whose audacity knew no bounds and whose strategic brilliance brought the Roman Republic to the very brink of collapse. His journey was not merely a military campaign. It was a testament to human will, an epic of survival, and a masterclass in psychological warfare. Born into a legacy of hatred for Rome, Hannibal inherited a sacred oath from his father, Hamilcar, a vow to never be a friend to Rome. This oath became the driving force of his life, fueling an ambition that would culminate in one of the most daring military feats ever attempted: the invasion of Italy from the north. To understand the sheer audacity of Hannibal's plan, one must first comprehend the geopolitical landscape of the 3rd century BCE. The First Punic War had ended in a humiliating defeat for Carthage, stripping it of its naval supremacy and its valuable territories in Sicily. Rome, the victor, had emerged as the dominant power in the Mediterranean, its legions seemingly invincible and its influence ever-expanding. In the decades that followed, Carthage, under the leadership of the Barca family, carved out a new sphere of influence in Hispania Moderna, Spain. It was from this base, New Carthage, that Hannibal would launch his thunderous assault. The Romans expected any attack to come from the sea, where their navy now reigned supreme, or perhaps a land invasion through the coastal routes of southern Gaul. They fortified these approaches, confident in their defenses, the thought that an entire army, complete with cavalry and colossal war elephants, would attempt to traverse the treacherous snow-covered peaks of the Alps was not just it was considered utterly impossible. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal set his monumental plan into motion. He gathered a formidable force, an army of approximately 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and most famously 37 war elephants. This was a diverse, multicultural fighting force, composed of Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, and Libyans, all bound by loyalty to their charismatic leader. The initial leg of the journey was itself a significant challenge, as Hannibal marched his forces from Hispania to the Rhine River in southern Gaul. Along the way, he had to subdue or negotiate with hostile Gallic tribes who viewed his massive army with suspicion and fear. At the Rhine, he faced his first major obstacle. A hostile tribe, the Volca, had gathered on the opposite bank, determined to prevent his crossing. Here, Hannibal displayed the cunning that would become his trademark. He sent a detachment under his subordinate, Hanno, on a covert night march up. Hanno's forces crossed the river unopposed and then moved to attack the Gauls from the rear. As Hannibal's main force began its crossing, on hastily constructed rafts and boats, the Gauls found themselves caught in a pincer movement. Thrown into confusion and panic, their resistance crumbled, allowing Hannibal's army, including the ponderous elephants, to cross the river and continue its inexorable march toward the mountains. The Alps stood before them like a jagged, impenetrable wall, a realm of ice, rock, and biting winds. The Roman consul, Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had been dispatched to intercept Hannibal, was stunned to learn that his adversary had already crossed the Rhine. Scipio realized with dawning horror that Hannibal was not aiming for the coastal route, but for the impassable mountains. As Hannibal's army began its ascent, the true ordeal began. The path, where it existed at all, was a narrow, treacherous track clinging to the sides of sheer cliffs. The local mountain tribes, the Allubrages, proved to be a constant menace. They launched a series of guerrilla attacks, rolling massive boulders down onto the winding column of soldiers and animals. In one particularly vicious ambush in a narrow gorge, Hannibal lost a significant number of men, pack animals, and supplies. He learned quickly, adapting his tactics by using his light infantry and Gallic guides to scout ahead and secure the high ground, preempting ambushes and fighting the mountain tribes on his own terms. The physical toll of the journey was immense. The men, many of whom were from the warm climates of Africa and Spain, were ill-equipped for the brutal cold. The temperatures plummeted, and snow began to fall, obscuring the perilous paths and making every step a potential slide into a chasm. Food became scarce, and the soldiers were forced to eat their pack animals to survive. The magnificent war elephants, symbols of Carthaginian power, suffered terribly. The narrow, icy ledges offered no secure footing for their massive frames. They slipped and panicked, their terrified trumpeting echoing through the desolate mountain pass. Several of them, along with countless horses and mules, plunged to their deaths in the abysses below. The psychological strain was just as severe as the physical one. Morale plummeted as the soldiers, surrounded by the bodies of their fallen comrades, began to despair. It was in these darkest moments that Hannibal's leadership shone brightest. He moved amongst his men, sharing their hardships, offering words of encouragement, and reminding them of the rich lands of the Po Valley that lay just beyond the peaks. He pointed toward the distant plains of Italy, telling them they were not just climbing a mountain, but the very walls of Rome itself. After 15 days of relentless struggle against nature and hostile tribes, a battered and depleted army finally descended from the Alps into the fertile plains of northern Italy. The cost of the crossing was staggering. Of the nearly 60,000 men and animals who had begun the journey from the Rhine, fewer than 26,000 soldiers and only a handful of elephants remained. They were a skeletal, frostbitten, and exhausted shadow of the proud army that had set out from Spain. But they were alive, and they were in Italy. The Romans were caught completely off. Hannibal's impossible march had shattered their strategic assumptions and placed a hostile army in their backyard. The initial Roman response was swift, but proved inadequate against Hannibal's superior generalship. In the first major clashes at the Ticinus River and the Trebia River, Hannibal's tactical genius was on full display. He used his superior Numidian cavalry to outflank and envelop the Roman legions, inflicting devastating defeats. These victories were not just military triumphs. They were powerful acts of propaganda. Gallic tribes in northern Italy, long resentful of Roman rule, saw Hannibal as a liberator and began to flock to his banner, swelling the ranks of his army and replenishing his losses. Hannibal's masterpiece of tactical brilliance was yet to come. The following year, in 217 BCE, he lured a large Roman army, led by the consul Gaius Flaccus, into a perfectly laid trap on the shores of Lake Trasimene. Under the cover of a thick morning fog, Hannibal concealed his main force in the wooded hills overlooking the narrow road that ran alongside the lake. As the long column of Roman soldiers marched into the defile, Hannibal sprang his ambush. His forces crashed down from the hills, sealing the entrance and exit of the trap and attacking the unsuspecting Romans from the flank and rear. The result was a wholesale slaughter. The Roman army was annihilated, and the consul Flaminius was killed. The Battle of Lake Trasimene sent a shockwave of terror through Rome. The path to the city itself seemed to lie open. In this moment of crisis, the Romans appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius, recognizing he could not defeat Hannibal in a pitched battle, adopted a new and controversial strategy of delay and harassment, earning him the nickname Conctitor, the delay. He shadowed Hannibal's army, launching small-scale attacks on his foraging parties, but refusing to engage in a full-scale battle. While this strategy preserved the Roman army, it was deeply unpopular with the Roman people, who craved a decisive victory to avenge their honor. The culmination of this phase of the war came into 16 BCE at the Battle of Cannae. The Romans, tired of Fabius's delaying tactics, assembled the largest army they had ever put into the field and estimated 86,000 men and marched to crush Hannibal once and for all. Hannibal, with a smaller, more diverse army of around 50,000, chose his ground carefully on an open plain. What followed was a tactical masterstroke that is still studied in military academies to this day. Hannibal arranged his infantry in a crescent formation, with his weaker Gallic and Spanish troops bulging forward in the center and his veteran African infantry held back on the flanks. As the massive Roman legions advanced, they pushed back Hannibal's weak center just as he had planned. The Carthaginian line bent inward, drawing the Romans deeper and deeper into a pocket. At the decisive moment, Hannibal ordered his elite African infantry on the wings to turn inward, and his superior cavalry, having already routed their Roman counterparts, swept around to attack the legions from the rear. The Roman army was completely encircled, trapped in a killing field with no room to maneuver. The legionaries were systematically cut down. By the end of the day, as many as 70,000 Romans lay dead on the field of Cannae. It was the single bloodiest day in Roman history, a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Hannibal had achieved the perfect battle, the complete annihilation of a larger enemy force. In the aftermath of Cannae, Rome was on its knees, its allies wavering and its very existence hanging by a thread. Hannibal's chief cavalry commander, Hannibal, famously urged him to march on the city itself, proclaiming, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal. You do not know how to use one." For reasons still debated by historians perhaps, a lack of siege equipment, an exhausted army, or a belief that Rome's political structure would collapse on its own, Hannibal did not march on the city. This decision may have been his greatest strategic error, though he remained in Italy for another decade, winning battles but never the war. Rome slowly and grimly recovered. They adopted a war of attrition, raising new armies, and gradually recapturing the cities that had defected to Hannibal. The tide eventually turned when a new Roman general, Scipio Africanus, took the war to Carthage's home turf in Africa, forcing Hannibal to be recalled to defend his homeland. The final showdown came at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, where Scipio, using Hannibal's own tactics against him, finally defeated the great Carthaginian commander. The Second Punic War was over, and Rome's dominance was secured for centuries to come. Despite his ultimate defeat, Hannibal Barca's legacy is defined not by the end of the war, but by the sheer brilliance and audacity of his campaign. His march across the Alps remains one of history's most compelling tales of leadership and determination, a journey that defied the limits of what was thought possible. He was a commander who understood the psychology of his enemies as well as the terrain of the battlefield, a leader who inspired unwavering loyalty in a multicultural army through years of incredible hardship. He brought the mightiest empire of the ancient world to the edge of destruction, and in doing so, carved his name into eternity. A military genius shocks the world by leading his army and war elephants across frozen mountains to challenge a mighty empire.